When we begin to understand this conflict, we must first anchor ourselves in geography, not just as a physical reality, but as a psychological one. Because power, at its core, is often about control over space, and few spaces in the modern world carry as much weight as the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow stretch of water, almost deceptively small when you look at it on a map, functions as one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. It is not just a passage of ships. It is a passage of influence, of leverage, of consequence. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil flows through this corridor. Think about that, not as a statistic, but as a dependency. Entire nations, entire economies wake up each morning assuming that this flow will continue uninterrupted. That assumption creates a kind of invisible contract, a shared belief that stability will hold. But what happens when that belief is challenged? What happens when a choke point becomes a pressure point? This is where the situation moves beyond geography and enters the realm of strategy. Control over the Strait of Hormuz is not just about naval dominance. It is about psychological positioning. It sends a message. We can influence the rhythm of the world. And in a system as interconnected as ours, even the perception of disruption can be as powerful as disruption itself. Markets react. Governments recalibrate. Fear begins to travel faster than any ship ever could. Now let's take a step deeper. Why does this matter to the average person sitting miles, maybe thousands of miles away from this waterway? Because global systems are not abstract. They are deeply personal. When energy prices rise, when supply chains tighten, when uncertainty creeps into the market, it shows up in everyday life. It shows up in the cost of transportation, in the price of goods, in the stability of jobs. The distance between a naval maneuver and a household budget is much shorter than we often realize. And this is where perspective becomes critical. Too often, we view conflicts like this as isolated events, something happening over there, disconnected from our daily reality. But the truth is, in a globalized world, there is no over there. There is only a network of cause and effect. The Strait of Hormuz becomes a mirror reflecting how fragile, yet how interdependent, our systems truly are. There's also a deeper philosophical layer here, one that speaks to human behavior. Control of critical resources has always been a central theme in history. From ancient trade routes to modern energy corridors, the struggle is not just about possession, but about influence. It raises a fundamental question. Are we building systems that are resilient or systems that are merely efficient? Because efficiency, while powerful, often comes at the cost of vulnerability. And vulnerability, when exposed, invites tension. This is where the tone of leadership matters. The approach we take, whether it is rooted in cooperation or confrontation, shapes not only the outcome of a specific crisis, but the trajectory of global stability. The challenge is not just to keep ships moving, but to keep trust intact. Because once trust erodes, every movement is questioned. Every action is interpreted through the lens of suspicion. If you think about it, this is not just a geopolitical issue, it's a human one. It's about how we respond under pressure. Do we escalate or do we stabilize? Do we react or do we reflect? These are not just questions for governments. They are questions for all of us in how we navigate conflict in our own lives. There's a lesson here that echoes the spirit of Les Brown, the idea that adversity reveals character. And on a global scale, moments like this reveal the character of nations. They reveal priorities, values, and the willingness or unwillingness to look beyond immediate gains toward long-term stability. So as we consider the importance of this narrow stretch of water, we must also consider the broader implications, because the real issue is not just the flow of oil, it is the flow of trust, the flow of cooperation, the flow of shared responsibility in a connected world. And if there's one thought to carry forward, it's this: when a single corridor can influence the fate of millions, the true measure of power is not the ability to control it, but the wisdom to protect it for the benefit of all. Once we understand the strategic weight of that narrow corridor, the next question becomes inevitable. What happens when tension turns into action? Because history shows us that pressure, when sustained long enough, does not simply disappear. It transforms. And in this case, it transformed into a direct and dangerous escalation between the United States and Iran, where intent was no longer implied, but demonstrated. At the center of this escalation was a decision that carries both tactical precision and psychological impact: the deployment of naval mines. Now, on the surface, a mine may seem like a simple tool. It sits silently beneath the water, unseen, waiting. But that silence is exactly what makes it powerful. It introduces uncertainty into an environment that depends on predictability. It forces every vessel, every commander, every decision-maker to operate under a new mental condition: doubt. And doubt, when introduced into a high-stakes system, can be more disruptive than force itself. Iran's use of naval mines was not just about blocking ships. It was about altering behavior. It was about sending a message without necessarily firing a shot across every bow. We can make this space unpredictable. We can make you hesitate. And hesitation, in a corridor like the Strait of Hormuz, has global consequences. But here's where it becomes even more complex. Because the response from the United States was not simply reactive, it was strategic in its own right. The U.S. Navy moved to counter this threat, not only to remove the mines, but to reinforce a principle that has long underpinned global maritime order: freedom of navigation. This is not just a policy, it is a statement of how the world should function: open routes, predictable systems, shared access. So what we begin to see is not just a clash of forces, but a clash of philosophies. On one side, the use of controlled disruption as leverage. On the other, the assertion of stability as a right. And when these philosophies collide, the battlefield is not limited to ships and water. It extends into perception. Every move is interpreted, analyzed, and amplified. Every action becomes a signal. This is where the psychological dimension intensifies. Because in modern conflict, perception often shapes reality faster than events themselves. Think about the individuals making these decisions: commanders, policymakers, analysts. They are not operating in isolation. They are operating under immense pressure with incomplete information and with the knowledge that a single miscalculation could escalate the situation beyond control. This is what makes such confrontations so volatile: not just the weapons involved, but the human element behind them. And this is where we need to pause and reflect on something deeper. Conflict at its core is rarely just about the immediate issue. It is about accumulated tension, historical grievances, strategic positioning, and perhaps most importantly, the human tendency to respond to perceived threats with decisive action. But decisive does not always mean wise, because when action is driven by urgency rather than clarity, the risk is not just escalation, it is misinterpretation. And misinterpretation in a high-stakes environment can be catastrophic. What we are witnessing here is a reminder that power is not just about capability, it is about restraint. It is about the ability to act without losing sight of consequence. The deployment of mines, the movement of naval forces, these are not isolated decisions. They are part of a chain reaction where each link influences the next. This is why understanding escalation is so critical. It rarely happens in a single moment. It builds, step by step, decision by decision, until suddenly what once seemed manageable becomes overwhelming. And yet, within this escalation, there is also an opportunity an opportunity to recognize patterns, to understand triggers, and to rethink responses. Because if we can identify how conflicts intensify, we can begin to explore how they might be de-escalated. This is not just a lesson for nations, it is a lesson for individuals. How often do we allow small tensions in our own lives to build unaddressed until they erupt into something larger? How often do we respond quickly rather than thoughtfully? The dynamics are different, but the principles are the same. There's a powerful idea often echoed in the teachings of Les Brown that you don't have to react to everything that happens to you, but you do have to take responsibility for how you respond. And in the context of global conflict, that idea becomes not just inspirational, but essential. Because the difference between escalation and resolution often lies in that space between stimulus and response. So as we examine this naval clash, this moment where tension became action, we must look beyond the surface. We must see it not just as a military event, but as a reflection of decision-making under pressure, of strategy shaped by perception, and of the delicate balance between strength and restraint. And if there's one thought to carry with you, it's this: escalation is rarely inevitable. It is the result of choices. And the power to shape the outcome lies not in the intensity of those choices, but in the wisdom behind them. By the time we reach this stage of the conversation, it becomes clear that what began as a regional confrontation has now expanded into something far more significant. Because when conflict touches a space as critical as the Strait of Hormuz, its impact does not remain contained. It radiates outward, influencing economies, shaping political decisions, and redefining relationships between nations. And this is where we begin to see the true weight of global interdependence. Markets do not wait for clarity, they react to uncertainty. The mere suggestion of disruption in this corridor can send energy prices rising, trigger volatility in financial systems, and create ripple effects that reach far beyond the immediate region. A decision made in one part of the world begins to influence the cost of living in another. It begins to affect business confidence, investment strategies, and even the stability of developing economies that rely heavily on predictable energy supplies. But beyond economics, there is a deeper tension unfolding, a diplomatic one. Because when military action intensifies, diplomacy does not disappear. It becomes more urgent, more fragile, and often more difficult. Channels of communication narrow, trust becomes scarce. And yet, paradoxically, it is in these moments of heightened tension that dialogue becomes most essential. This is the contradiction at the heart of global conflict. The very actions that make diplomacy harder are the ones that make it more necessary. Nations begin to reassess their positions. Alliances are tested. Neutral parties are drawn into the conversation, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly. And what we start to witness is not just a bilateral issue between two countries, but a complex web of interests where each actor is trying to protect its own stability while navigating an increasingly uncertain environment. Now let's take a step back and look at the psychological dimension of this. When uncertainty rises, the natural human response is to seek control. For nations, that control can manifest in different ways, through military presence, economic measures, or strategic alliances. But control, when pursued without coordination, can lead to fragmentation. Each player begins to act in its own interest, often without fully understanding how those actions interact with the broader system. And this is where instability grows, not just from conflict itself, but from the lack of alignment in how that conflict is managed. It raises an important question. In a world that is so deeply interconnected, can any nation truly act in isolation without affecting the whole? The answer, increasingly, is no. And that realization brings us to the role of diplomacy, not as a fallback option, but as a central strategy. Diplomacy is not weakness. It is not the absence of strength. It is the disciplined application of communication, negotiation, and foresight to prevent short-term actions from creating long-term consequences. But for diplomacy to be effective, it requires something that is often in short supply during conflict: patience. Patience to listen, patience to understand, patience to move beyond immediate reactions and consider broader implications. And this is where leadership becomes critical, because true leadership is not defined by how forcefully one can act, but by how thoughtfully one can respond. It is about recognizing that every action sends a signal, not just to an opponent, but to the entire international community. There's also a philosophical layer to this that we cannot ignore. Conflict reveals priorities. It exposes what we value most: security, influence, stability, or cooperation. And in moments like these, nations are forced to make choices that will define not just the outcome of a single crisis, but the tone of future interactions. Will the approach be rooted in competition, where each side seeks advantage, or will it evolve toward cooperation, where the focus shifts to shared stability? This is not an easy shift to make. It requires trust, and trust is not built overnight. It is built through consistent actions, through transparency, and through a willingness to engage even when it is uncomfortable. And yet, without that trust, the cycle continues. Tension leads to action, action leads to reaction. And before long, the system becomes locked in a pattern that is difficult to break. This is why moments like this matter so much. They are not just crises, they are crossroads. They present an opportunity to rethink not just strategy, but mindset. To move from a reactive approach to a proactive one, to recognize that long-term stability cannot be achieved through short-term dominance alone. There's a principle often emphasized by Les Brown, that you have greatness within you, but greatness is a choice. And on a global scale, that idea translates into something powerful. Nations have the capacity for cooperation, for restraint, for wisdom, but they must choose it, because the path of least resistance is often escalation. It is immediate, it is visible, and it feels decisive. But the path of lasting impact, the one that requires discipline, reflection, and collaboration, that is the path that shapes a more stable future. So as we look at the global impact of this conflict and the delicate dance of diplomacy that surrounds it, we must ask ourselves not just what is happening, but what is possible, because the future is not determined solely by events. It is shaped by the responses to those events. And if there's one thought to leave with you, it's this: in a world where every action echoes across borders, the greatest power is not in the ability to influence outcomes, but in the wisdom to choose outcomes that benefit us all. And now we arrive at a phase of the situation that is often less visible to the public eye, yet absolutely critical to the outcome, the process of restoring order once disruption has taken place. Because it's one thing to create instability, but it's another thing entirely to remove it. And in the context of the Strait of Hormuz, that responsibility falls heavily on mine-clearing operations. Now let's really think about what that means. We're not talking about a simple cleanup effort. We're talking about a highly technical, high-risk, and deeply methodical operation where every movement must be calculated. Naval mines are designed to be hidden, to blend into the environment, to remain undetected until it's too late. So clearing them is not just a physical task. It's an exercise in patience, precision, and discipline. Imagine operating in an environment where danger is invisible, where every step forward could trigger a consequence you cannot see. That's the reality facing those involved in mine-clearing missions. Specialized vessels, divers, unmanned systems, all working together in a coordinated effort to locate and neutralize threats that were deliberately placed to create uncertainty. And here's where the deeper lesson begins to emerge, because this process is not just about technology, it's about mindset. It's about the ability to move carefully in a situation that demands urgency. It's about balancing speed with accuracy, action with awareness, and in many ways it reflects a broader truth about how we deal with complex problems, not just in geopolitics, but in life. When disruption occurs, the instinct is often to respond quickly, to fix the issue as fast as possible. But what mind clearing teaches us is that not all problems can be rushed. Some require deliberate attention. Some require us to slow down, to assess, to understand the full scope before taking action, because moving too quickly in the wrong direction can make the situation worse. Now, from a strategic standpoint, these operations serve a very clear purpose: to restore safe passage, to reestablish confidence, and to signal that stability can be regained. But notice that word, confidence, because ultimately that's what's being rebuilt here. Not just the physical safety of a waterway, but the psychological assurance that it can be trusted again. And trust, once disrupted, is not easily restored. This is why mind clearing is as much about perception as it is about execution. Every successful operation sends a message. The risk is being managed. The system is being stabilized. But until that message is fully believed, uncertainty lingers. Ships may hesitate. Markets may remain cautious. The shadow of disruption doesn't disappear immediately. It fades over time as consistent actions reinforce a new reality. And this brings us to an important insight about recovery. Recovery is not a single event. It is a process. It requires sustained effort, coordination, and a willingness to stay engaged even after the immediate crisis appears to have passed. Because the real challenge is not just removing the mines, it's restoring the flow, the rhythm, the normalcy that existed before. And that takes time. It also takes cooperation, because operations of this scale rarely happen in isolation. They involve coordination between different units, different technologies, sometimes even different nations. And in that coordination, there is an opportunity, a chance to shift from confrontation to collaboration, even if only temporarily. This is one of the paradoxes of conflict. The same situation that creates division can also create moments of alignment. Shared challenges have a way of bringing clarity to what truly matters. And what matters here is stability. Now let's take this one step further. If we look at mind clearing not just as a military operation, but as a metaphor, it begins to reveal something powerful about how we navigate complexity. In our own lives, we all encounter mines, hidden risks, unresolved tensions, unseen consequences of past actions. And just like in the Strait of Hormuz, dealing with them requires more than quick fixes. It requires awareness, patience, and a commitment to doing the work thoroughly, because ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. It only increases the likelihood that they will surface at the worst possible moment. There's a principle often emphasized by Les Brown, that you have to be willing to do what is hard today in order to create what is meaningful tomorrow. And that idea fits perfectly here. Mind clearing is difficult, meticulous, and often slow, but it is necessary, because without it, progress remains blocked. So as we consider this phase of the conflict, this effort to restore order in a space that has been deliberately disrupted, we begin to see a broader pattern. Disruption may capture attention, but restoration defines outcomes. The ability to rebuild, to stabilize, to move forward, that is where true strength is revealed. And if there's one thought to carry with you, it's this: clearing the path is rarely as dramatic as creating the obstacle, but it is infinitely more important because it determines whether progress is possible at all.